let's start with the peace deal or the peace negotiations. And I'm losing track, actually, of where we are exactly. So, Ollie, let's start with you.
First of all, a peace plan is quite a grand statement. What we're dealing with following the Geneva talks is one or possibly two possible frameworks. It's a moving target, as people basically explained to me. And the picture's changing every day, essentially based on what the Russians are putting down and how difficult they're being. And that's a feature, not a bug of this negotiation design, because on the one hand, we've got essentially Russian demands. On the other side, we've got Ukrainian concessions. And then at the end of the process, it's a Russian veto. But if we to take the document which emerged from Geneva, it's essentially a working paper. And it's what it comes down to is a draft treaty to partition Ukraine. The question is where. It removed some of the worst parts of an earlier plan, which was concocted by Russians in the first instance, but also Trump's special representative, Steve Witkoff. And it's removed some of the more egregious moments. But the main questions have been unresolved, and they're reserved for leaders. So, Russia obviously wants the rest of Donbass, but the issues of neutrality, NATO and that partition line, I mean, they're still very much in parentheses.
So it is, and you put that very, very well, it's essentially a plan to partition Ukraine. But as Ollie said, Ed, this is better than the first version of this deal that was cooked up, first of all, by Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and the Russians essentially trying to replay the Gaza playbook, if you will. And there was an extraordinary leak of a conversation between Steve Witkoff and Yuri Ushakov, the Russian representative, to kind of essentially advise him on how to deal with President Trump. And this caused shockwaves, but President Trump himself seems to think this was a perfectly normal thing to do. Let's just listen to this clip.
That's a standard thing, because he's got to sell this to Ukraine. He's got to sell Ukraine to Russia. That's what a deal maker does. You got to say, look, they want this. You got to convince them with this. That's a very standard form of negotiation. I haven't heard it, but I heard it was standard negotiation.
Ed, what does that tell you about what America is trying to get from this?
Well, I think it is reasonable for Witkoff, who wants a deal, to talk to the Russians about how to get one. My concern is I don't think he's offering the Ukrainians the same kind of possibilities and advice about how to proceed and get their way. So I think it's asymmetrical. That's my first fear. The other fear is who leaked this and why? They were obviously in Ushakov's phone. That's the way it looks to me, because there was another conversation with his colleague Kirill Dmitriev that was also leaked. So someone is in there. Is it the Americans trying to sabotage, the deep state trying to sabotage the deal? Is it the Europeans who are very unhappy? Is it even the Ukrainians? Is it even the Russians, some people say, some hardliners in Russia? But that's a kind of interesting question, and it tells you that all of this is very improvisatory. It seems to be going very strongly in one direction, then it goes in another direction, and it makes it very unpredictable.
Shashank, I have to ask you, before we get on to the details of where this deal is now, what is your suspicion of who leaked this? Because this is a world you know well.
Well, look, this call was apparently over WhatsApp. And, as we as journalists know, Zanny, WhatsApp is supposed to be end-to-end encrypted, which means, you can intercept it, but you just get sort of garbled nonsense, which indicates someone has got one of the endpoints. And I think Ed's right. Ushakov is a common element in these leaks. So I think it is highly unlikely a Western intelligence service, having got access to the device of Putin's foreign policy aid, would be stupid enough to leak the fact that it has got into this phone. That's not how they tend to operate. They would use that access, any signals intelligence agency worth its salt, and acquire the intelligence. They wouldn't burn their access. So this reads more to me like perhaps he's played it out on speakerphone in the wrong Moscow hotel room, and it's been intercepted in that way. I don't think a professional Western service is burning their access for the sake of this.
Hard to imagine what Russian would be well served by getting that out there, though.
Well, I think you got it right. I think someone tried to sabotage some of these processes.
So we have an extraordinary process. We clearly have someone trying to sabotage it. But let's just get to the nuts and bolts of what we know about what the contours of this deal look, if it ever becomes a deal, might be. Ollie has told us that it is effectively a partitioning of Ukraine. The question is where. Chris, what about the other elements? What do you think is still on the table in terms of the first version? Cut Ukraine's forces dramatically, said no NATO ever. Talk us through what you think is still on the table and whether it will be acceptable.
Well, with the large proviso that this thing is changing all the time and we don't really know how firmly held any of the positions or decisions are, it's definitely a lot better than it was. At the moment, they're not talking about handing over a big chunk of territory that the Russians want but have not yet managed to secure in the Donbass. And that's really crucial territory because a lot of defensive lines are there. It seems like the cap on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces has been raised from 600,000 to 800,000. And if that's true, well, that's a number they can more easily live with because it's not really very much less than they have now. And then there's reservists and so on top of that. And also, perhaps they've taken out the idea that they have to write into their constitution, the Ukrainians, that they can never join NATO. So if all of those excisions remain excised, and that's a very big if, and we can perhaps come on to that, this is a lot better for Ukraine than it was. The problem now becomes, will the Russians accept it? And there's still things there that Ukrainians will have difficulty swallowing, but it's a dynamic situation.
So it started off as a 22-point plan?
28.
28-point plan. A number of excisions have been made.
I think it's 18 now.
It could be 18. I mean, this is sort of reminiscent
19.
of what happened in Gaza,
19.
right? Where it's 19 now. No one is exactly sure, but there will, it seems, be some limitations on Ukraine's military, its ability to defend itself. Shashank, do you think those, from what you read of what's in there at the moment, is that something that is, how damaging would that be to Ukraine? And is it something that Ukraine could accept?
I don't think it would be very damaging at all, actually. And I've been speaking, as I was sitting up there in Ladakh trying to talk to European diplomats, some of them saying, this is deeply disturbing. Any constraint on the sovereignty of a European state is a terrible precedent. And I understand what they mean. But in practice, let's be very clear, Zanny, even if the limit on Ukraine's army had stayed at 600,000, most analysts looking at this don't think that Ukraine would have a force or would be able to afford a force much bigger than 600,000 after the end of this war. It's just unrealistic. And similarly, of course, on long-range missiles, there appear to be in these, even in the first draft, by the way, in the 28 points, no restrictions on Ukraine's possession of long-range missiles, whether that's Taurus, whether that's Scalp, Storm Shadow, or future American Tomahawks. And so, in practice, I think this is extremely permissive in terms of what Ukraine can have. The only caveat to that is, of course, the original proposal rules out any European military footprint on Ukrainian soil, and I think that is the bit that would have the biggest consequences for Ukraine's post-war defensive plans.
That's really interesting, Ed.
The other thing that really troubled me about this plan is the vagueness of the US security guarantee. So it was highly significant that the US wrote language in that seemed to imply that it was going to participate in this security guarantee, and that was progress. But if you looked at the terms of the language, it was just unenforceable. It was vague and unenforceable. And if you put all of that together, you can't have European troops. If the US forces this deal on Ukraine basically with a gun to its head, and you're expecting the power that's done that to provide the security guarantee, that left me feeling very queasy.